Right, hello there. Yes, right, so hello there. Just checking all the things. Today, we're going to take a look at creating a pose with accessory item using Studio Toolkit. So IMVU Studio Toolkit, we're going to create an item with a pose. So that's an accessory item with its own accessory pose. And this is kind of tricky because where's the control panel? Hang on. This is kind of tricky because we have to do it a couple of ways. Well, we have to use a couple of the different Studio Toolkit files because of the way that well, it's just basically because of the way that Blender works relative to 3D Studio Max. I mean, if everyone had 3D Studio Max, this wouldn't be an issue. But anyway, blah de blah. That's beside the point. So, Studio Toolkit, if you haven't got it, where do you go to get it? Hang on, let me find a URL. The IMVU. Oh, it wants me to log in. Heck no bit. I'm going to cheat. Oh, help. Yes, we could all do that. Oh, here we go. Right, so if you haven't got it, go here. So create.imvu.com/ or is that backslash? Never know. Articles / studio / toolkit. And you want to scroll down the page and get the one that says download for Blender 2.9x LTS. You'll actually want to be using Blender 3. Well, any version 3.0 and above. So the latest version of Blender will be fine, which is 3.1, I think. But download, it'll download a zip file. And then what you want to do is edit. This is in Blender Preferences. Edit Preferences. And then click the Install button when you are in Add-ons. And then all you do is click the Install button, browse to the zip file. Don't unzip the file, you just load in the zip file as it is. So it's, where is it? Why did it save it? Yeah, downloads. Why isn't it downloads? And oh, there it is. Duh. So select install add-on, and it'll install the zip file straight into the interface, and then, just for the sake of showing, it'll install this, and then just make sure that the checkbox is ticked. And that will install the tab, which we can then access for our projects. Let's close that. So let's make our accessory with pose. So what you want to do first is make sure that you are starting from a clean scene. So new, general, that will reset everything to make sure that the tool loads in correctly. So general, and then view sidebar, which is where the toolkit lives. and then click the tab that says IMVU Studio Toolkit. Click that, and as we're making an accessory, normally we would need to use the attachment tool. Just click Append Attachment File. Normally we would be using this. It shows us the skeleton initially, and that's basically so that we can select a bone. So we use the eyedropper. So this is going to be something for the hand. So if we click on the hand bones, it'll select the hand bone and then show us the avatar. So normally we would be using this to make an accessory, but as we're making an accessory with a pose, we have to use a different setup. And that's using, or well, we have to use the clothing skeleton, because we need to access the actual names of the bones that are part of the skeleton structure of the avatar versus what we have for accessories, which use their own skeletal structure. So we dispense with the attachment tool and we have to load in the clothing tool. So let's just reset, general new file, don't save. So view sidebar again because we reset everything. Toolkit, clothing tool. So all we do is click on append clothing file. And that drops this into the scene. So we can change between the two if we want. Doesn't really matter for this. And all we need to do is create our accessory, the actual mesh relative to this skeleton or this avatar. So let's create something simple. Cylinder. Going to adjust the properties. Don't need it to be that. Don't need the radius to be that big, so let's go with 0.10. Going to make a stick. Let's make that 10. So it's a large stick. So that's the basic mesh. Don't need to do anything more complicated than that for this. So that's our mesh. I'm going to assign a material. So we want to go into material properties. There's no material, so click on new. That'll create a new material instance and then populate it with all the gubbins. Let's preview that. We can change its color temporarily so that we can see something different. Give it a name. So let's call this broomstick. It's actually a broom handle. And then in shading properties, or shading properties, shading workspace, we want to sort out the material and assign an image to it. So add texture, image texture. Drop that into place and then click drag color to base color. So that's just made that connection, but we want to add an image. So click new. Give this a title, broomstick. Let's try something that is 64 by 512 because our broomstick is a very long, thin object, so we don't need a 512 by 512 for this. Set our generated type. Let's use color grid and then, oops, okay. There is our image. assigned to our object. So that's the very basic material that we need. UV editing. Going to do a bit of UV editing, sort out our placement. So that's our UV map. Let's switch to island. Switch to island. Select these two. And we can use scale or the universal. Just scale these down so they are the right shape for the top and the bottom. Those out of the way. And we can use the rest of this. Click, drag, and adjust our texture. So that's just adjusted the UV map relative to the image. What we need to do from here is, whilst we're here, is save this image, because we'll need to, for when we import the mesh into Studio, because it doesn't like, this is a procedurally generated image, so it's a virtual image. Well, they're all virtual because they're on a hard drive, but this is generated. It's procedurally generated, so we have to save it and convert it into a bitmap. So image, save as, and then we find our location we want to save, broomstick, PNG. Let's save the format. Now let's stick with PNG. Don't need any compression. Everything else is okay. Then just save as image. Click. And that's saved it. And what that's also done, if we go back into Shading Workspace, although it hasn't changed the name that's associated with our image slot, the reference is now an external image. It's the image that we just saved. So it's converted the procedural data into an image that is then re-referenced back into Blender. And this will save us some headaches later on. So back to layout. That's our stick. It's got its material, and the material has an image. So let's just save this. File, save as broomstick. Oops. A. Right, so next thing, set this up. What we need to do is add smooth shading to our object. Hang on a second. Got a spammer in chat, just got to get rid of that. Right, so shading, smooth shading. So if we look at our object, we can see that it's faceted. So we've got these hard lines. We want to get rid of those. So select our object, object, shade smooth. And that'll just make our stick look like a stick, make it look round. So that's our stick. And all we need to do next is position it where we want it to be. So we're going to use the widgets and position it at the avatar's hand. So grab, rotate, and what we want to do is position this relative to the bone that we're going to parent it to later. We're going to weight paint it to, which is the hand bone. That's this square bone here. So we need to position the mesh relative to that. So that looks about right. And we just do it roughly because we can finesse the position when we pose, when we create the pose for the avatar with the stick in its hand. So that's that. So that's the first step, position. Next step is to weight paint. So before we do that, because we are using the toolkit, what we have to do first is bind to the armature. What this will do is create a link between our mesh and the skeleton. Because again, we're using the clothing file to do this, not the accessory file. So the accessory would be a different process. So make sure our mesh is selected and then just click bind to armature. And what this does is it links the two together. So if we then select our mesh and we go into object data properties, we now have a whole load of vertex groups, one for every bone of the skeleton, that we can then weight paint our mesh to, or the appropriate one. So for that, paint weights. So first we're binding the mesh to the armature, and then we are weight painting, or painting the weights. We can't do that until we have all of these groups available. So what we're going to be doing is selecting one of these and painting our mesh to it. So paint weights, our mesh is selected. What we want to do is select the one that we want from the list. So right hand, we're going to paint our mesh to be associated with that. So we've got the tools available now. So full weight and full strength. So that means every vertex that's painted will be red. Don't have many vertices on this object because it's a simple stick. Just paint all of those red. So this means that this bone has 100% control over this mesh. Double check. Exit paint mode. So we just click the weight paints button again. So these toggle. So if we click on that again, it toggles us out of weight paint mode click it, toggle in, out. Same for posing. So if we want to check whether this is working, click on the pose button and it'll switch the skeleton into pose mode, so we can select a bone, press G and just wiggle the arm, and we can see that our stick moves with it. So press escape and that'll just reset it. Again, click pose to toggle out. Let's just save this. File, save as B. Then we have to do a bit of tidying up. So select our stick. We want to be in Object Data Properties so that we can see the vertex group list. And we need to get rid of all of these unwanted entries in the list. So select, just click on it to highlight, and then we want to click on the minus button. And that will remove the listing. So we just want to go down the list, get rid of all of those, and then all the way to the top, get rid of all of those. We can't multi-select these because of the nature of vertex groups and weight painting. So they have to be deleted individually. So all we have left is RT hand. And we can test this. Go into edit mode. Select none. What we can do is just switch into wireframe to make this easier to see. We can test this. So this is our group. Click on select, deselect, and we should find it selects our entire mesh, and that's what we're looking for. So that's good. Right, so that's almost part one. What we need to do next is export this so that we have a separate FBX to the pose that we're going to make next. Now, I'm not quite sure if this is absolutely necessary, but it's force of habit. So select the mesh, shift click the skeleton, and for exporting, we don't go into the file menu like we used to. We use the export settings and the export button that we now have in the toolkit. So just click export and it exports the file for us. So we can test this in Studio. Let's get Studio open. Create a new project. Now this is where it gets a little tricky. So what we want to do is derive from the base avatar. I'm going to use PID 80. Derive. Right, so all we're doing is loading in a mesh. So import FBX. So import button, FBX, whoops. Browse to our file. Broomstick B. Open. So this gives us a preview. So the reason why when we're creating our accessory, if we're using generated images, we have to make sure that we save the image and convert it into a bitmap, because Studio doesn't like generated texture data. It'll balk, it'll freeze when you try and import a mesh that has any such materials assigned to it. So make sure that your materials include actual bitmap images, otherwise this doesn't appear. So that's a preview, 2 skeletons, 1 mesh. Set up FBX. Leave this is all okay, that's okay. Mesh ID, give it a random number. Next, there's our broomstick, there's our material. That's what it's going to bring in. And it'll do this initially because it's brought in the skeleton that we don't need. So component, skeleton, this is important. So we need to reset the avatar skeleton. So we're in assets, and this is the bad skeleton. This is the one that it's brought in. What we want is to reset it to female 04 anime. So click on that, preview, and there is our stick associated with our avatar. So the next step will be to make the pose. Let's just minimize that, go back into Blender, layout. So that's step 1. What we can do to make this a little easier for the next step. Select our object, object data properties, just rename this, click type broomstick. This just makes it easier to see the file when we're importing. Let's just save this again. So for the pose, what we want to do now is reset the file. So file, new, general. So we're starting from a clean scene again. New sidebar. Again, so we're accessing the tool. You'll see in a minute, Roy. So we're accessing the sidebar. There's the sidebar. Click. So this time we want the animation tool. So access that and click on the append animation file. So this time we'll get this. And this is the rig that we use to create poses and avatar animations. So we have to create the item in the clothing file because the avatar's arms are in their reset or default position. That basically means if the avatar is stripped of all animation, the arms stick out to the side, and this is the default. And when we make and position our objects, if they are accessory items or to be worn as accessories, we need to make sure that they are made relative to this pose, this default pose, not this one that we're looking at in the animation file. So always start your projects, if you're going to make an accessory with a pose, from the clothing tool, as we showed earlier, so that you are using the correct pose, essentially, for the avatar. But for the next section, which is the pose itself, what we need to do is append. So file, append. We need to append the stick that we just made. We need to find it. accessories, broomstick. Broomstick B, so double click. We want the object folder, which is here. Double click. And we should find, there it is, broomstick. So we don't need active collection. So uncheck that. Everything else is okay. And just click append. And that'll bring in the dependencies. That's the things that are associated with our stick. And as we're in pose mode by default when we're in the animation tool, we need to switch from pose mode to object mode so that we can select and delete this skeleton. Pose mode, object mode, select and just delete it. We don't need it. So what we have to do now, let's just save this so that we've got a base file. This is C. So what we have to do now to create the pose is link mesh to the skeleton or to the rig. So if we select our mesh, we go into modifier properties, we should have an armature modifier already assigned to this object. So modifiers, and yes we do. So this is where it's a little confusing because we don't necessarily have a skeleton in the same way that we do in the clothing file. But there are a couple of references that we can select from and set the object or the target. So make sure our mesh is selected. Click on the little box and we'll get two entries. The one that we want is anim. So if we click that, we find that our stick automatically jumps to the correct position relative to where it should be. And you might notice our stick, the mesh is here, but the origin point is up here. And this is why it's important to use the correct file to create the initial object. Because the armature is controlling the mesh, not necessarily the object, which is indicated by the object origin. So if, let me just switch back to, if we switch back to pose mode just quickly so that we can see, can we see where is origins? You don't need to do this, this is optional. But we can see, if I just move that, we can see that the avatar, the rig, controls the mesh, but the origin point stays put. So the origin point defines the object itself, but the armature or the rig controls the mesh because of the association between the vertices of the mesh and the bone, that's the hand bone, RT hand, that's controlling it. So let's go back into object mode. So double check. If you find that your mesh is stuck in space and is not moving, make sure that you are in object mode. Your mesh is selected and that in armature, in modifiers, your armature is set up so that the target is anim. So double check that. And then what we can do once that's all done is do a pose. And let's just save this so that we have a restore point. D. Then we'll create pose. To answer your question, Roy, what all it is just going through the process of showing how to make an accessory item, air quotes, with pose, with a custom pose. So we've created an object using the clothing tool rather than the attachment tool, which we would, as you know, we would ordinarily use. But if we want to do a pose, we have to use the clothing tool. And then once we've created our accessory relative to it being a pseudo clothing item, we can append it. Yeah, it's tricky because we can't just use one file to do this. We have to do it this way just because of the way that, you know, Blender works with respect to the FBX files that are produced and how that then gets imported into IMVU. So that's what we've got so far. All we need to do now is create our pose. So for this, what we want to do is enable auto key. And this will mean that whenever we move one of these control elements, let's switch back into pose mode. It's at top here. So once you've fiddled around with your mesh object to make sure it's set up correctly, in order to pose, we need to toggle back into pose mode, which then means that we can access all the control components of the rig to create a pose. So we've got auto key enabled, and what this means is that whenever we move one of these control points, it'll drop in a series of keyframes in the timeline. So if I just grab this, so pressing the G key, when we click to confirm the position, although the wrist is broken, it's dropped in these keyframes. So G to grab and move, R to rotate, and then all we're doing is essentially the same as we would do normally if we were creating a pose. So let's see, what can we do with this? It's the wrong one. So GR. Yes, so Roy's just mentioning that you have to be mindful, particularly with accessories, that if you are using scalars, your meshes may look a little out of whack. Let's do some sort of kung fu stick fighting-ish pose. And we have to remember that whilst we're doing this, we are limited to a certain degree by what we compose, because the mesh is positioned in the clothing file relative to the hand bone, which is here, which may mean that we can't reposition the bone or reposition the object relative to the rig or the skeleton. So we have to kind of, although we're approximating the pose, not the pose, we're approximating the position of the object in the clothing file, we do have to make sure that it is where it needs to be, because once it's in the pose file, we don't have nearly as much control. So I'm going to use the widgets, make this easy to do. Don't have nearly as much control over the position of the bone, well, the position of the bones and the mesh of the avatar relative to our object. So this being where it is, we can't change any of these bones. And we're going to switch from global to local, so the bones rotate relative to themselves. So there are certain things that we can do, but there's a lot of things that we can't do because we're limited based on the position that we set up in the clothing file. So this is a bit fiddly because obviously we're getting down into the fingers. So that's our rather wonky kung fu pose with our stick in hand. It's like a bamboo pole rather than a broomstick. Right, so save. Save as ABCDE. And then we can export this. When we're doing that with this, all we're exporting is the pose data. As this is a static pose, we want to enable make pose, and we want to make sure that all the bones of the default pose are overridden by the pose that we've created. So if there are any bones that we haven't moved, if we do not have export all bones enabled, the defaults that are on the avatar may come through. So enable that. Everything else is okay. And then all we do again is click the export button in the export tool. Export, it'll do its thing and export the FBX, which we should now be able to import into IMVU. So Studio. So we've already got our stick in place. So import FBX. What did we call this? Broomstick. Broomstick E. Open. So it's going to bring in, this is the preview. Set up FBX. So this is okay. Don't have to do anything here. Next, that's nothing there. There is our animation. Review. It's going to bring in the skeleton as well. So import. That'll make the avatar go all, what's that, the thing? Kurt Russell in the Arctic. So again, we need to set the skeleton. So we're switching back to the skeleton again. Root node anim. So again, it's brought in the skeleton, which we have to reset back to female 04. Preview. That resets it. We've still got our stick, which is good. So now, as we are deriving from the avatar, the female avatar, which is 80, we've got these pre-filled actions. That's the word I was looking for. We have to replace the ensembles, and we have to do this. Configure. So we're clicking on the 3 ellipses to get the Ensemble Editor up, and in the asset item we should have, click the list, scroll down to the bottom, there is our animation. Just going to replace that. We need to do that for all of them. We can go back to the settings in a minute once we've done this, but because we've derived from the avatar, we have to do this for all the ensembles in order for it to use our sequence. Because of the random nature of all these ensembles, you could be waiting 10 minutes for your pose to appear. Bigger. What we should find, if this is all done correctly, preview, is our pose. It looks kind of freaky at the moment because we've still got these properties and settings in place. So 1, 2, 0, place. One, 2, 0, and see, it's because we set that one up as 0 that we just did. It's now looping it forever. But that is our pose. We just have to keep doing this for all of these ensembles because we derive from the avatar. Because unfortunately, this doesn't work with the empty mood. And it doesn't work with the empty clothing item either for some reason. So if you want to do a pose, an accessory with a thingy, yeah, an accessory with a pose, you have to derive from the avatar. Where were we? In this one? No, we've done that one. We'll show that in a second once we've done all these. Whoops. Aha, we've missed one. Of course, we can't remove these because being the default avatar, they are always in place. Have we missed one? No, we haven't missed one. Why did it do that then? This is the thing, you have to replace them all. No, that's right. So there is our accessory item with custom pose. It's a bit of a long-winded way of doing it, but it's the only way we can do it if we're using Blender. So you have to create your accessory using the clothing file, import your mesh into the pose file, or into the pose tool, I should say, into the pose tool. So what you end up with is two FBX files. One is your mesh and the other is your pose. So as we were saying, let me save this. So file, save as. My sticky one. So ordinarily create by using the empty mood 10,945,930. But derive this will probably work now. So import FBX. So what we're going to do first is import the mesh. So we're just going to go through this process. We're going to give it a random ID. Everything else is okay. It's got our material. Next. Preview. Right, so it's got our mesh. What we're going to do now is import the FBX for the pose. We'll go through the same process again. Everything else is okay. That's all right. That's all right. Import. So if we go into component, create an action, new action, start.idle. Click on ensembles. We want to create an ensemble. There is our animation. Apply. Preview. Doesn't work. For some reason, don't know if this is a bug or not, but you can't load in an FBX file that has a skeleton into, so this is the empty mood. So this file is specifically for, I know. Oh, you're welcome, Fanta. What was I saying? Oh yes, you can't, because this is the empty mood, which is, it's stripped of everything to do with the underlying avatar, except for allowing pose data. So you can import different FBX files, but you can't mix and match the different types of FBX file. So this being the empty mood, you would only be able to use avatar animation files. So if you load in an animation file on top of a mesh FBX, it won't work. So when you are doing your accessories with poses, you're going to have to stick with using the base avatars. So that's 80 and 191. The ID, so 80, which is the female avatar, and then 191, which is the male avatar. It doesn't even work with the empty clothing file, because that's set up just essentially to receive meshes, not pose data. So there is our custom accessory, the custom pose. Karate chop. What we can also do actually, so that's what this yeah, okay, so we'll call it quits there. For the next one, what we'll look at is creating an avatar. Well, it's what people call an avatar. So it's essentially just a pose pack, a set of poses that are, for each one of these, we have our own custom animation. So that's what we'll look at in the next one. But we'll leave it at this so that this video is just dedicated, or this stream is just dedicated to creating our sticky pose with a stick. That is IMVU Studio Toolkit to create a custom accessory item with a custom pose. Awesome. Right, so thanks for watching, Roy, Fanta, and lurkers, and we'll see you on the next one, which I'll see if I can do it in the next day or two. But if you've not used the toolkit, it's worth downloading and getting hold of and using, because it makes the whole process of creating so much easier. Oh, should also add, once you've exported, if you want to edit your pose again, make sure that you select the rig and you go into pose mode. That'll just re-enable the rig so that it can be reposed. And again, as we've got auto key in, it will replace or update whatever poses or whatever position. Because you could do an avatar. You could do an avatar with your custom stick, but each one of these is a pose with the stick. But we'll leave that for another day. But if you go back into your pose file and you start mucking around with the avatar, make sure it's backing Ooh, that's gone horribly, horribly wrong. Gotta watch out for some of these bones collapsing on themselves. Right, okay. Yes, we'll leave it there, and we'll see you on the next one. So thanks for lurking, lurkers. Thanks, Roy, Fanta, and Co. Bye for now.